Hi, everyone, and welcome to Catalysts for Change, the show where we explore the stories, strategies, and turning points of leaders driving meaningful impact in their communities and across the country. I'm Adam Lister, and I'm so glad you're here. Today's guest is someone who helped shape modern Nashville, Ralph Schulz. From national nonprofit leadership to nearly 2 decades at the helm of the Nashville Area Chamber of Commerce, Ralph has been a guiding and consistent force through economic boons, natural disasters, and generational transitions. What always struck me about Ralph isn't just what he's led, but how he has led. A believer in situational leadership, a student of character-driven decision-making, and someone who uses films like 12 Angry Men and 12 O'Clock High to teach the craft of leadership, Ralph brings intentionality and empathy to even the toughest conversations. I've known Ralph for nearly 15 years and worked for him for 4 of those. I've seen firsthand his passion for Nashville and community development, as well as his approach to leadership, which has opened doors to unique opportunities and facilitated community partnerships, transforming Nashville from a small southern town to a world-class city. In today's episode, we'll talk about Ralph's journey from national nonprofit leader to civic catalyst and how he led through crisis and growth, the leadership principles that guided him, and the lessons he's passing on to the next generation. Let's dive in. Ralph, thank you for being here today.
Adam, always love to be here with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to see you. I had to arrange a time for us to sit in this studio just so I could get an hour of your time uninterrupted. So thank you for playing along. You fell for the trick. It's hard to conceive as I drive into this studio today and I see literal buildings and manifestations of people's dreams in this city that did not exist 10, 12, 15 years ago. It's hard for me to conceive of any part of Nashville that you have not had a role in supporting or developing. Yet you did not begin your career working in community development. Rather, you started your nonprofit work in the 1970s with Junior Achievement. I'm curious, what drew you out of college, brand new person into the workforce? What drew you into national or into nonprofit work?
Well, when I left the University of Tennessee, I came to Nashville and took a job with Junior Achievement as a program director. It was my first job out of college. And I really came with the intent of building a network because I knew of the business people that were engaged, and then leaving nonprofit work. But an opportunity arose about 3 years into that program director job to be the executive director of Junior Achievement in Jackson, Mississippi. And I felt like that was going to be a great opportunity to be fully in charge, fully accountable, and learn things I would never learn if I just stepped into a corporate setting. I felt like the people my age that were moving around in those corporate settings, they were moving slowly and learning little. And so that was the first step, and then it was just a continuation of opportunity after that.
You led chapters in Jackson, Dallas, and New York. What did you take away from working across such variant jurisdictions?
Well, one of the great things about working in Junior Achievement at the time was there was a little bit of a process, right? You would have a leadership role in the field at one of the Junior Achievement operations out across the country, and then you would have a time when you might be assigned a position or have a position at the national headquarters. So the whole way through my Junior Achievement career, I had this blend of being on the ground and working Junior Achievement in a town or a city, and then working at the national headquarters and being out across the country making things happen with sort of a national leadership. So that's how I met some of my earliest mentors, some of the people that were great leaders in business on a national and international level, and I had the exposure and the opportunity to learn from them.
You mentioned you planned to work for Junior Achievement for a little while and leave the nonprofit space. That obviously is not the trajectory of your career. How did your time as an executive or a national executive with Junior Achievement shape what your view of leadership looked like, your exposure to those mentors that would ultimately influence the way that you approached leadership throughout the rest of your career.
I happened to be at Junior Achievement at a great time with a great leader at the top who had real vision and aggressiveness. And his team, the people that were assembled around him, were expected to be the same way. And as it happened, there was a lot of great things happening in the United States of America at that time. You had the continuous improvement, Deming kind of an approach. There was a willingness to change the way things had been done for decades before. And so everybody was in kind of an aggressive mood. We had great leadership at the Junior Achievement Organization. And it really did just expand the horizons. When you have the opportunity to move around the country, and this will date me, but move around the country and sit with Baldrige-winning CEOs and find out how they transform their companies, you're learning a lot along the way. So you take some of those lessons and you start to apply them. And at Junior Achievement, with that great top leadership, Carl Flemke as the CEO, and his willingness to invest in new things and trust the people he worked with, you got an opportunity to pave new ground.
You have talked a lot about Junior Achievement, even in the time that I've known you, and I know that organization had a big impact on you, and the opportunities that it provided are ones that you may not find in other places. So thinking about leaving an organization like that is not an easy decision, I would imagine. I'm curious, what ultimately brought you back to Tennessee and into Nashville in the 90s? And what was it about the Adventure Science Center that drew you to that organization specifically?
Well, leaving Junior Achievement was encouraged from other sources. That is, the CEO wanted to make a change at the top. And so I departed Junior Achievement at that point in time. I had met Jack Ferris, who was on the National Junior Achievement Board, who was the CEO of NFIB. And he gave me the option of moving to Washington, D.C. or moving to Nashville. And, in the 90s, I was responsible for a national business meeting that was held here in Nashville. I could start to see things happening in Nashville. And we had family in the area, so we opted for Nashville. And I did my time with NFIB, and the Adventure Science Center needed a new CEO. And that was a lot of fun because it was kids, it was education. It was an organization that was in deep trouble at the time I joined it. And as I went around the community and asked people questions, I asked them 3 questions. 1, how important is the Cumberland Science Museum at the time? 2, what's your observations on its performance? And 3, under what circumstances will you become involved in its resurgence? And I found a lot of interest, a lot of energy around that. So what drew me back to Nashville was, first and foremost, it's a great place to live. There was family around here, and the nature of the work was really desirable.
And these are technically still nonprofit or charitable organizations, going from a Junior Achievement, NFIB, Adventure Science Center. But you really transitioned from nonprofit leadership to a civic and economic leadership role during that period of time. I'm curious to know what changed in how you thought about impact for the communities that you served during that transition.
It really didn't change. I mean, to me, nonprofits, the biggest difference between a nonprofit and a profit-making business is where you get your capital. That to me is all of the same fundamental business concepts apply. So you need to have a great culture. You need to have great leadership throughout the organization, and you have to have a team atmosphere, a team, where everyone is in it to support each other successfully. We all share the wins, we share the losses. When I interviewed for the chamber job, one of the things I told them right at the beginning of the interview was, look, I've given you a resume with achievement over my career, but you need to know not a single one of those things was done alone. And so, I did some time in profit making as well, and I just didn't find any real difference except where you get your capital.
When you and I met for the first time, I was working at the chamber, and you had this practice of inviting new staff into your office and would ask them to tell you their story. And I'm sure that was, in some respects, a bit of a fun game to kind of know where on their line they would start. And ultimately, what I think you were interested in, because I started with I just came from this place, and go further back. We went all the way back to the place where my family was born, and which turned out that we had a shared connection there. But what I never told you was I went back and I looked you up after that because I wanted to know more about your story. Because I thought by the time our 45 or 60 minutes had been up, I didn't get to ask you nearly all of the same questions. But I read something about you at the time that said the chamber job, the CEO role, was the only other job that you might have been interested in. And as long as I've known you, I've always been curious why that was.
Because it was the opportunity to affect opportunity for millions of people in the Middle Tennessee region. I mean, I loved the Science Center job. It was one of the most fun jobs I'd ever had in my career because it was about kids and it was about education. It was about delivering value for them that was memorable and it's sort of a catapult for those young people. But the chamber had its hands and its fingers in all the big stuff. And the big stuff is what affects hundreds of thousands and thousands of people. The chamber had a great role in the community. The idea of public-private partnership that existed from the early 90s forward was really compelling and propelling to the community. And so the opportunity to be involved in something that could make a difference for so many people was incredibly alluring. Now, some people have asked me why not run for political office and achieve that same thing. And one of the things I really like to say about it is the accountability in that chamber job is really direct. You have great community leaders and great political leaders that are engaged, and they have an expectation of performance, and that expectation of performance has a timeline. And so, I loved the accountability of find the way to get it done when it's supposed to be done. Look, Adam, we've talked about this before. But those leaders of the 90s that established that platform, I mean, Nashville owes it all to them, really. When you look at the business leaders and you look at Mayor Bredesen, who, we're still living off of the strategy that Mayor Bredesen planted. We owe a great debt, and that gave us all the opportunity to, in some ways, exceed expectation.
You made a comment about what was alluring was the amount of opportunities and things that the chamber was involved in, hands in a lot of projects. Was there ever a moment, particularly kind of early in your time at the chamber, where you thought, holy cow, this is bigger than I thought it was going to be?
I don't think I've ever had a job that it didn't feel that way. I can remember numerous times in my career moving into a job and thinking, oh my gosh, I have no idea how to actually do this. There were times when the undertakings were large and complicated and risky. The earliest time in my time at the chamber was when the Predators were about to leave town. And, that would have been a very significant move for Nashville. It would have been the first dot on a down trend line because we all know how much those outward-facing organizations project what Nashville is literally around the world. And so that was risky. I mean, I was told that the deal was done and it couldn't be stopped, and we couldn't afford to let that stand. And so, we assembled a team of people the way we always approach things. And we found that one thing, that one pressure point, 14,000 average in the arena per game for the following year, that would stop a move. And that team made it happen, along with David Freeman, who assembled a local ownership group that, that local ownership makes a difference. They invested heavily. They rolled the dice too.
In the spirit of find a way to make it happen, one of the stories that I tell most often is about a time you and I were working on, or the chamber was working on a major infrastructure project. And there were members of the legislature that did not want to see that project passed. We got down to the last day of a legislative session, and you and I walked into a state lawmaker's office at 6 a.m, the day after he lost a vote on the House floor, with 5 draft amendments in hand. And I remember sitting on the couch in this lawmaker's office as he flips through the first and says, I can't do that. Flips through the second and says, I can't do that. And flips through the third and says, I can't do that. It gets to the fourth and I can work with this one. Ultimately, we were able to preserve the pathway for this infrastructure project. And the second part of that story that I remember the most is walking back to our offices, and you and our executive board were assembled in the conference room, and I'm waved in and I explain the report. I'm asked to give the report. And I said, well, we preserved this project and we passed this other legislation, and the General Assembly is adjourned, sine die. And our chair at the time, completely devoid of any expression on his face, looks at me and says, well, that was a lot harder than it should have been. And that was what counted for congratulations in that moment. But walking out of there, I thought it was a good reminder of we needed to do the things we needed to do to preserve an opportunity for Nashville to do the things that it needed to do. Right. And it was harder than it needed to be, which gave us an invitation to think differently about how maybe we approach those problems in the future. I'm curious to think about some of the major moments you had at the chamber leading through crisis. While you were CEO, you led the chamber through the Great Recession, the 2010 flood, a global pandemic, the near loss of the Nashville Predators, and a downtown bombing, not to mention significant and dramatic shifts in state, local, and national political landscapes. What do you think defined your leadership through those moments, and how did you keep the chamber aligned around a core vision to continue to push forward despite all of those moments?
There's complexity to that answer. Just because I don't feel that the vision or the path forward was kind of a singular definition. I think in most cases for the leader, the important thing is to be calm, right? And frankly, not to have exaggerated exuberance when you win, and not to be deeply depressed when you're low. You just you assess the circumstance and you say, okay, this is what we have, and what do we need to assemble to overcome it? And then it really comes down to people, right? I mean, at the chamber, I can't think of a time we didn't have an excellent team of strong staff people, an excellent team of board and board leadership, an excellent relationship with few exceptions with political officials. And the role's clearly defined, right? Public officials know what they're supposed to do. The business community knew what they needed to do. The rest of the community, kicked in. One of my favorite stories is during the flood. We're walking down the street with the FEMA administrator. Everybody, all the political leaders are there, and we're all walking down a street in a neighborhood. And the FEMA administrator's on the phone, and I hear him saying to the EPA administrator, who usually sends a team into a community with that kind of disaster to fence off, basically to keep people from getting into toxic materials. And the FEMA administrator was saying, hey, you might as well just save your travel money because these people already have the debris out at the curb. And that to me is what's so significant about Nashville, a team. So in all of those challenges that you're talking about, there was a common sense of what needed to happen, clear role definition about who had what role to play, and then competent people in place to execute on their role. Again, during the flood, the CVC and Metro had Broadway and the riverfront ready to go for CMA week when people thought it would be impossible. So, Nashville is just one big team of people. And as long as everyone understands their role and they invest, keep their promises, there's not many challenges Nashville can't overcome.
Well, and I think you see that team of people and that can-do attitude show up in crisis moments like a flood, but it also comes together to drive major economic development successes like Amazon and Oracle and the Music City Center. Thinking a little bit about the organizations.
Can I just mention something there?
Of course.
Because it really does come down to having a plan and knowing what the drivers in the plan are and having a mutual agreement on those things, right? So Nashville has that economic success because it's first and foremost a livable place, whether it's friendly, welcoming, people who trust each other, whatever. It is a very livable place. And then secondly, people are welcome here. They are, talent. Nashville is a talent magnet because of livability, but also because of the rest of the people. And that's where job creators want to be, whether it's Oracle or Amazon, or it's a business just starting up, birthed here in Nashville. It's where job creators want to be because of those other two things.
Well, thinking about the team and the chamber and the other work that you've been involved in, there are seemingly kind of countless numbers of initiatives and organizations that were launched out of, in partnership with, or in support of the chamber, including the Entrepreneur Center, Vital Signs, and Academies of Nashville.
Sports Council. You could go down the list. What were we trying to solve with all the launch of all of these organizations? And how did you manage the launch of these entities and think proactively and at the beginning of them about how they could then become self-sustaining? Well, first and foremost, it starts with research. It starts with information. It starts with data. You find the gaps, right? If you're not performing to an expected level, why? Why aren't you performing that level? And that takes study, that takes information, that takes research. And then, again, one of the great things about Nashville is when you put that information out in front of people, they may have different solutions and different strategies, and they might throw those all into the mix. But everyone is focused on overcoming whatever that obstacle is or creating the opportunity that is necessary. So it really starts with that research, and then the plan, which is a mutually discussed document, gives framework to it. And then it's just about making sure that everyone who should be participating and can be participating is in the game to make it happen. It's why I think the mayor of Nashville is such an important figure in this region, and we are a regional economy. We're interdependent, 10 counties. There are attributes that exist in one place that don't exist in another, and all of that creates this great combination, right? But the mayor in Nashville sets a tone. They set a tone for vision, they set a tone for collaboration, and they set a tone for policy pursuits. And so, when you have that public leadership, strong, proactive, and aggressive, and you have an investment community that wants the community to be a better place to live, and they're willing to make those investments either through their businesses or through philanthropy, you've got a pretty strong winning combination.
Yeah. It was one of the things that drew me to the chamber was, you talk about being involved in so many things, is there was always something exciting to do. And in addition to that, there was always someone who felt more passionately about it than you did. Uh-huh. And it was fun to feed off that enthusiasm, and it gave this belief that you could do some really incredible things with maybe a slightly less advantaged quiver.
Tom Orrick, I'm remembering a story about Tom Orrick. One of the things I've always felt that we as staff people at the chamber have the opportunity to gift to people is the opportunity to make a difference they'll never forget. And it reminds me of a story with Tom Orrick when Nashville for All of Us, the whole vote about making English the Nashville's language. And, it would have been such a devastating referendum to lose. And of course, we won it 3-1. But I remember Tom Orrick had only been in town for a year, but he experienced what we all experience. You keep your promises, you find your passion and you invest in it. And he did that in his first year. And when that referendum came up, he raised his hand and said, I'd really like to lead this effort. And the rest of the business community said, well, okay, we'll work with you. The night that we won that 3-1, he and I were out having dinner. And I was asking him, what's different between New Orleans, where you came from, and Nashville, where you are now? And his answer was an answer that choked him up. He said, Ralph, I think maybe this campaign was one of the most important parts of my life. And I can't think of anywhere else where I would have had a chance to make the kind of difference I made here. That's a gift you just love. Tom Orrick, one of the most memorable events in his life.
I think about often you have talked about your approach to situational leadership, and you've referenced more times than I can remember the quadrant with high willingness, high ability, and I think we've got that in that story, and seeing that in a lot of the civic leaders that have stepped forward is a real attribute to the city. But I'd love to expand on kind of that example with Tom or with others. When you think about the high willingness, high ability quadrants, and I know 12 Angry Men and 12 O'Clock High are not just some of your favorite movies, but the leadership anchors, there are leadership anchors there for you. Can you talk a little bit about how you use situational leadership in day-to-day decisions and why those resources or tools are essential to your outlook?
It all starts with the initial assessment. Being observant, listening, hearing from people. When I would talk to community leaders, it was important to find out what's their passion, because then they're going to be all in. And who do they want to do that work with, that helps give you clues on the team that has to be assembled. But that's a little bit of a reference to willingness and ability, right? I mean, gosh, every day, constantly, I would ask myself on a particular task, who's most willing and who's most able to achieve that task, because we can cover a whole lot of ground when you have willing and able people running their own show and achieving the necessary result. And situational leadership is a developmental tool too, right? It's an easy way to have a conversation with a person who may have to do a task that they don't like or undertake a task that they're not particularly capable of at that point in time. And it creates a positive conversation between the leader and the follower so that they can discuss, well, what do you need to be able? What would it take for you to be willing? And so that situational leadership model is, to me, it's a great framework for conversation that helps people identify the most appropriate leader for a task and helps discuss how people can develop in their leadership.
What lessons from 12 Angry Men, 12 O'Clock High, do you think early stage leaders need to take away from?
I think so often leadership is seen as a negative, manipulative term, and the use of power is seen as a negative, manipulative term. I feel like both of those films are great exemplifications of the positive outcome from knowing what you're doing when you're leading and when you have power to exert. That I think, again, it just boils down to such simplistic lessons that first you have to know what you're dealing with. You have to observe. You have to listen. The reason I always ask the question about what's your story is I want to have some understanding or depth about what makes you go, what makes you tick, where did you come from, what did you like, without asking those questions directly. When you tell me your story, it's uncovering in a very voluntary way who you are and what you're best at and what you like most. So, that's, and of course, I've always seen those films as a great. There are others as well, but I've always seen those films as a great device.
Yeah, you have found ways to let other people step up and lead. Sometimes when they're ready for it, and sometimes when they're not.
I depended on other people stepping up.
Well,
and leading.
And I think about my one moment in particular when I wasn't necessarily ready as I thought I might be. We were walking into an office one day to raise some money for an initiative that we were working on. And as we're approaching the door, you suggested that this might be a good opportunity for me to take the reins of this conversation and essentially make the ask in this moment. I nervously accepted, but then you also took it a step further to say, now, if you ask for too much, you might lose credibility. But if you ask for too little and you can't get it done for that, we lose extra credibility. And so don't screw it up. And what I wanted to ask you in that moment was what's the right amount that we need to be asking for? Right. And but you trusted me to not make a mistake. And you didn't leave me entirely to my own devices in that meeting. I had a lot of support in that conversation. But what I'm curious about is, as a leader, this was not a high stake or a low stakes moment. This was a high stakes initiative that we were working on. How do you know when it's time to take a step back and let others lead in those moments? And how do you spot them and feel comfortable with the risk that's associated with a mistake?
First and foremost, it comes back to observation. I knew that when I was asking you to do that you had it in you. I knew I could trust the fact, because I had observed your work, that you were going to handle that well in your own style, differently necessarily maybe from the way I handled it. But I trusted that. And then secondly, it's not like the fate of Western civilization hinged on everything that we did. Mistakes are things to learn from. We learned a lot from the transit campaign of 2018, right? You don't like losing or missing the mark, but the important thing is, where do you go from there? And so in that case, I'm presenting an opportunity that might be just a little beyond what you expect your reach to be, but I feel you can get there. And the fact that it's a little bit beyond where you think you might be makes it super valuable when you win. So, I had a football coach in high school. When I ran my last wind sprint of my career in football, I asked him the question, how did you know you weren't going to kill us, and with these wind sprints? And he said two things that really struck me. Number one, he said, and it stuck with me. He said, I know you have 20% more than you think you've got, and it's my job to get that 20% out of you. And the second thing he said was, he pointed to our center, who's a big guy, and he said, that guy, I won't mention his name, but he said, that guy, he's got more heart than the rest of the team combined. And when I see his hands go to his hips, I know we've had enough, because he'll take it all the way. So those are lessons along the way that I learned, is observe, trust, and create opportunity. We're both winners when you do that, right? We both win. So,
yeah, I think also recognizing that you can learn from those mistakes is a critical aspect of leadership that often, in my opinion, gets underappreciated. One of the most difficult decisions I had to make early in my tenure when I took over an organization was recognizing through observation that a particular employee just needed to have a different opportunity. The heart wasn't in it. And by no fault of anybody, it was not the right place anymore. And I remember calling you, agonizing over this decision, and that I felt like we needed to make, and ultimately said to you, I feel like that I haven't done enough to help this person be a great employee. And very succinctly, you said, you probably haven't, and they probably still need to go. And that stuck with me, because I thought, okay, you're right on both accounts. And what do I need to do as a leader to not be in that situation again, where I don't want to reflect on this moment and say, for the second time around, I probably haven't done enough, and they probably need to go. When I think about the lessons in civic and organizational leadership, I've thought before, there's not really a career path that is natural for folks to wake up one day and say, I want to engage in nonprofit and civic leadership as a intentional strategy, but that folks are driven by their interest in serving their community, they're mission focused, and nonprofit or civic leadership creates an opportunity to engage in that work. What I notice often is people tend to lean really heavily on the heart and the will, and hope that kind of carries them through the hardest moments. I'm curious from your perspective if that is a thing that you also have seen, and if it is, or if it's not, what advice would you give to folks that want to engage in this sort of work in order to be successful and understand how to lead in ways that are effective, you having done it in a non-traditional way?
I think the heart and will are just so vital, because there are many capable people in this work that could make lots of money and gain lots of fame doing something different. And so I think that in the nonprofit work, You really do. You do have to have a mission orientation, and it really does have to be, consuming. And when you're out of it, as it was with me, when I was out of it, there was just this nagging thought that I wasn't doing what I was put on this earth to do. And then you have to pay attention to that. But you also have to have competence. The heart and the will, they're the willing part, right? You still have to have the competence. People are investing in your leadership, and you need to be continuing to develop your leadership and your capabilities to do what needs to be done. So, and that changes all the time. For people that enjoy change, it's easy because they're always pursuing a different, maybe even to a fault, they're pursuing something different. For people that like stability, it's a little bit tougher. You have to kind of force yourself to press forward. But for people that are built like me and you and others, you just can't get the satisfaction unless you're doing something that's got a mission connected with other people. Now, let me just say this: I don't think that business people, CEOs or otherwise, are devoid of that mission status. What they are doing for their employees and their customers a lot of time is they're fulfilling a need because their leadership is, that CEO's leadership is capable and delivering the goods. It takes all kinds to make all these things happen. For me, I just felt like I needed to be in the direct front line. I needed to be out there actually doing the work.
We've talked a lot about kind of the arc of Nashville over the last several minutes. You are now in a different phase of your life and your leadership, mentoring students at Lipscomb University. What is it about that work that excites you? And what do you hope that the leaders that you're mentoring in your executive in residence time will walk away from that allows them to be successful and energized into the next phase of their work?
Well, I don't know what they'll see valuable. It's going to kind of depend on each individual and what they need. I mean, a lot of things we've talked about here are things that I'll talk about with students as well, and it'll just be a part of their learning process. But for people at this stage of my career and the stage of career that so many of us are at as boomers, right? What's important is what's following. What's important is, you love being at Lipscomb because those are people just starting the journey. In some cases, they've started the journey, but they're still early. The opportunity to give them something that is of value, something that they can use, something that will help them achieve more out of themselves. Again, that's a gift, right? So, I remember when I went into consulting work back in the 80s, I remember thinking I was going into not a skill building role. I was now going to be in a skill using role. That did not turn out to be exactly the case, but it was largely the case. One of the nice things about my time after that consulting role was that, look, when COVID hit, wow, big learning curve. So exciting in the sense of needing to adjust, right? You hate the damage that it's doing to lives, to livelihoods, to people. But the community depends on these organizations to help find that path forward. And you have to do it under circumstances you never anticipated. That's the fun. And because we experience that, sharing that experience is really fulfilling. It's a draw.
Now, I was thinking about all of the different things that you've been involved in your time at the Nashville Chamber, and the ways in which people might talk about your legacy. And when I was sharing,
I really don't have a legacy. The chamber has a legacy, one way or the other.
Well, I appreciate that. Maybe if I'll accept the premise of your statement that the chamber has a legacy and people will remember your role in facilitating the legacy of the chamber or your time there. I was sharing this morning before I left the house what I was going to be doing today, and that we would be in this studio recording this podcast. And my son goes, "Oh, Ralph, I know him, the Christmas light and Mountain Dew guy." And I thought, yeah, that's right, to you. And the unique aspect of the work that you've been involved in, and I think the unique aspect of the work of the chamber, is that it is so dynamic and so unique in what it's involved in that folks will experience the chamber and your relationship with the chamber in a lot of different ways that may not even be consistent from one person to the next. And I think that that's a really cool way to think about an organization, that Nashvillians will experience all of this work in different and hopefully positive ways. And I know over the last several years, you have consistently been taking a bear market approach to Nashville. What gives you the most hope and excitement about its future? Where are you most hopeful about Nashville?
Look, it's the people of Nashville. You've heard me talk about how I feel Nashville's personality was born after the Civil War, when those Irish railroad immigrants came over and created Nashville as a distribution center. What was as important to me, they changed the economic face of Nashville, but the way they did it was important. They waved at their friends and they said, "Come to Nashville. We'll help you get started. We'll be your first contract. We'll make investments in your business." And I think that personality of Nashville has not only survived, but surged over time, especially when you see immigration to the area. You just see an infusion of new dynamic thinking, whether it was distribution after the Civil War that turned into publishing, that turned into music, that turned into finance, that turned into healthcare, that turned into privatization. It is the dynamic people that are drawn to this place. And what draws them to this place are the people that are here, right? So that's why I have great faith in them. One last thing on that, Adam. It's a little more technical, right? But think of the vision of the people in the 90s that began a process of recovering a Nashville economy that had arguably been in decline for 20 years, the 70s and the 80s. And them saying, we are going to build a sustainable economy. And to set it up right, we're going to have to invest for 10 years without seeing a lot of return. But after that 10-year time, we're going to start to see the return, and it's going to be the return we are looking for. It's pretty amazing when you look at the public and the private leadership of that time to be that resolute about the future.
Ralph, you have spent your career helping Nashville grow with clarity and creativity and a commitment to the people at the center of each new plan and strategy that you have championed or helped to lead. So I want to say thank you for investing in this city and the legacy that you have contributed to at the Nashville Chamber, and continue to invest in what's next. That is it for this episode of Catalysts for Change. Again, I want to say a huge thank you to Ralph Schulz for joining me and sharing such thoughtful reflections on leadership and service and how to build a better Nashville. Ralph's career reminds us that the real impact often comes not from chasing the credit, but from showing up, asking hard questions, and investing in people over time. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, leave a review, and share the episode with someone who's also leading through change. Catalysts for Change is brought to you in part by the Southern Research Collaborative, transforming data into action to amplify the power of communities. Thanks again for listening to Catalysts for Change, and until next time, I'm Adam Lister. See you soon.